This is a tutorial on how to draw the figure using pen and ink wash. I already have my figure drawing penciled in to a slightly greater degree of detail than I normally would. At least I did in my previous demo. The amount of penciling you do is really up to you. So sometimes I'll just block in my basic armature and then go in with a pen. Sometimes I'll put in the armature plus the volumes, then go in with a pen. And sometimes when I really want to be accurate, if I'm doing an illustration, I'll pencil in the whole thing up to almost completion before I start inking. I wanted to show you different kinds of processes, which is why I completed this drawing a little more. And then, instead of using a dip pen, I'm using one of my favorite fountain pens. This is a TWSBI ECO, and it's filled with waterproof Noodler's black ink. Now, traditionally, fountain pen inks are not waterproof. They're water soluble, so they don't clog the feed. But there are a couple of brands of black that are really good because they're waterproof. I can go over them with ink wash or watercolor, and they stay put really, really well. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to start my inking. I'm going to speed this up so I don't put you to sleep. But essentially, I'm paying attention to the rules of line. I'm trying to make the line quality a little bit darker on the shadow side, thinking about my overlaps. This pen, one of the advantages is that you can actually tease a little bit of line variation out of it. Not much, but enough for this drawing. All right, so I'm going to start inking and speed this up. All right, I've inked the contours, and then after that, I've indicated light break in pencil. So I'm paying attention to what kind of shadow I'm looking at. Where I see a body shadow, I create a soft edge. Where I see a cast shadow, I create a sharp edge. So even at this stage, I'm paying attention to exactly what kind of shadow I'm looking at. Now I'm going to take my pen and put a hatch everywhere I see the light break to indicate the core shadow. I'm going to try to follow the form, but really the direction at this initial stage is not particularly important. I'm looking for the thickness of the core shadow, however. So in some places it's going to be thin, in some places it's going to be a little bit more diffused, a little bit thicker. So that is a concern. And I'm definitely curving my lines to indicate the fact that we're dealing with some kind of curved form. where I'm seeing a cast shadow, I'm going to try to leave the edge sharp and unhatched. So for instance, here I'm seeing a little bit of a cast shadow. I'm just going to leave a line there, and then I can see that it transitions back into body shadow. Alright, so I'm going to speed this process up a little bit. And then when we come back, I'm going to fill the rest of the shadow with a single value. Okay, so I've indicated the core shadow and the origins of the cast shadow absolutely everywhere. Okay, so I've indicated the light break by putting in my core shadow everywhere. The next step is probably to go into the lighter area and start indicating a little bit of the halftones. So for instance, the separation between the adductor group and the vastus medialis, for instance. I can put a little bit of hatching here and there in the lighter side. That's what I'm going to do right now. Alright, now that I have a few of the halftones indicated, I'm going to go in and hatch a value that represents the general value of the shadows. Now again, this process is quite flexible. I can use wash for this purpose. The balance of hatching to wash can vary from drawing to drawing, from style to style. Sometimes you'll see drawings which are mostly wash with a little bit of hatch. Sometimes you see a lot of hatching with a little bit of wash. I'm going for sort of a 50-50 effect. So I'm going to hatch a little bit, and then everything past this next step is probably going to be done mostly with wash. So I'm going to change my angle a little bit and start filling in everything I see a shadow with a little bit of hatching. Now, where I see a body shadow, I'm going to hatch slightly past my core to create a halftone. Again, this is something that the wash will do as well, but I like having a little bit of hatching in my shadows in this particular technique. I guess, look, it's a question of style, really. So everywhere I see a body shadow, I'm hatching ever so slightly past my first level of hatching. Okay, just like using pure pen and ink, the technique varies from artist to artist depending on the kind of hatching they do, the thickness of the pen, and look, even the pen you're using will change your style a little bit. So the way I draw in dip pen, is different from the way I'll draw with fountain pen. And then fountain pens have different nibs, different qualities, and they change your style a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit and finish this, and then once we're done, then we'll hit this drawing with a little bit of wash. Now that I've applied a layer of hatch to the shadow, I'm going to start hitting this drawing with the ink wash. Before I do though, let me think about where to put the ink wash, what to use the ink wash for. I think usually I use the ink wash for areas that are very, very difficult to do in pen and ink, which is what? Well, separating the highlights from the lights. That would take a really, really fine, delicate hatch, which I'd have to apply everywhere. What else? So besides separating out some of the highlights from the lights, also maybe getting some of the darker contrast. So again, this is something that takes a little bit more time to do in pen and ink by itself. So this technique generally flows a little faster than pen and ink, which takes a little bit more layering and layering and layering. I find this technique to be slightly faster, obviously depending on how you use it. So since an ink wash would work light to dark, the first thing I'm going to do is indicate which areas I'm going to leave really light, and then mix up a really, really light wash, apply it everywhere but my highlights. I'm going to be using the same ink I used in my pen, my Noodler's waterproof ink. Usually fountain pen ink is not particularly great for watercolor washes, simply because it's quite often composed of a number of different pigments which have a tendency to separate out when they're used with water, used in a brush and allowed to sit for a little while. This one doesn't though. I've already tested it and it seems to work pretty well. Alright, so I'm going to mix up a very, very light gray. It's a good idea to have a little test piece of paper to try your washes on before you use them. I'm glad I did, because actually I think that's going a little bit too dark. Alright, and now let's try it somewhere. So we have a little bit of a halftone here and a few little highlights. So let me wash over this whole spot here, other than my highlight. And then, because I don't want sharp edges to form between the highlight and the light, I'm going to use a little tiny bit of water to soften the edges of my wash so that we get a slightly smooth transition. So notice that the lid goes a little bit darker as it's working its way down. Again, this is something else that's somewhat difficult to do with just our pen alone. So this little halftone here, the separation between the adductors and the quadriceps, the fact that the leg is generally going darker this way, these things can be done using our washes. The foot is a little bit darker here. We can do that. Alright, we've got some very, very subtle separations between the ribs and our abdominals here. We have a little bit of hatch here. mostly to indicate some of the darker values. But this is, again, something else that can be done with our ink wash. Things that will be difficult to do just with our hatches. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with this, speed up a little bit, and then we come back. We'll do some of the stronger contrast in the shadows with our ink wash. Okay, so now that I have some of the more delicate halftones, some of the highlights, I'm going to go into the shadows and make them a little bit darker. Now, I also have the option to do this aspect with another layer of hatch. The fact is, I'm probably going to do both. I'm going to go a little bit darker with my wash in the shadows to get a little bit closer to the contrast, and the very last layer I'm going to hatch. Now, this can be dangerous depending on what kind of paper you're using. If the watercolor paper starts to buckle a lot, you're going to start getting uneven hatching, which is a problem. Sometimes the paper will start to tear, so we'll see how this goes. If the hatching doesn't sit well on this paper after I apply wash to it, maybe I'll keep going with the wash. Okay, so let's do that right now. We're going to mix up a slightly darker wash here. This fountain pen ink is very, very concentrated. So I have to be kind of careful how I use it. And full disclosure, this is the first time I've used this ink for washes, so I'm a little bit tentative. I'm testing my paper, testing my washes, and I'm working little by little. I'm trying not to go too dark right away. Okay, let's start getting a little bit more contrast in the shadows. And then using a little bit of water to smooth out the washes. As a general rule, if you've never particularly used the ink or the paper combination before, test it out. You'll find that certain papers work well with certain inks. And that some ink might feel kind of light, and then when it dries, it'll dry a lot darker, or it'll separate out, or it doesn't bleed quite as well, meaning that it doesn't quite give you smooth transitions. Don't assume that all inks are going to work the same. They definitely don't. All right, this seems to be working okay. Can't really tell until it's fully dry, however. So I'm going a little bit darker. I'm going to try to leave the very darkest values for another layer of hatch, if I can. That's the plan anyway. We'll see how well my plan works out here in a second. Constantly watching the edges of my washes so they don't end up sharp. Watch your washes. Sometimes a wash that starts off smooth will end up with a sharp edge. That can happen. The other thing is when you guys are working with washes, as with any kind of watercolor technique, you want your board to have a slight angle. So in the previous demo I had about 10 degrees of angle. In this case I don't, which is problematic. So it's a sacrifice I've had to make for the sake of you being able to see this drawing as well as possible. But when the washes are on a flat surface, they, instead of rolling down, sometimes sneak back up, if that makes sense. Washes will run from a wetter area to a dry area. So if one part of the wash is starting to dry, the wetter part is going to leak back into the drier area. There's a technical term for that in watercolor, which I can't remember right now. Drawback or kickback, something like that. It just creates irregular surfaces sometimes when washes run all over the place, which is why it's important to have your washes run downhill as much as you can. That said, I'm working really thin, layer by layer, and that's preventing that from happening. That washback problem, if that's what it's called, usually an issue when you're dealing with large, really heavy washes. Okay, so I'm going to silence myself for a little bit, speed this up, and when we come back, I'm going to put another layer of hatch on this, or at least try to. Let this dry for a little bit. I think before putting the very last layer of hatching on this and trying to get to some degree of finish, the next best step is to take your eraser and see what's actually going on with this drawing. I would use a kneaded eraser. It seems to cause the least amount of damage, and works really well on watercolor paper. Okay, let's take a look at this. It depends how much finish you want out of this drawing, but I think we're pretty close to done. I don't want to belabor the drawing. It's one of the charms of these pen and ink drawings. They, at their best, are pretty light. I mean, they have a light touch. They're not labored over. And that can be a really big challenge in doing these kind of drawings, overworking them a little bit. So I'm trying not to overwork this. I am going to put another layer of hatch, though. Okay. Let's do this. There's some places where I think the core shadow now needs to be reinforced. I really like the sense of roundness in the ribcage here, so I'm going to go in and reinforce some of the hatching and get slightly stronger contrast. I'm not going to do it everywhere. There's some places where I kind of like the hatching as it is, maybe like this area. We'll see. Ideally, you should be kind of at the finishing stage in this drawing. Don't put in too many layers of hatch. If you need to go darker, I can always put another layer of wash over it. So I'm going to speed this up, and hopefully this will be the last video. Okay, I worked on this a little bit more off camera, simply because I like to rotate my paper different directions quite often and lean in. Definitely have to lean in to get the face, which would have blocked the camera. Okay, so I'm going to call this drawing more or less done. I'm going to leave the groin part blank so that it doesn't get flagged by the sensors, hopefully. What else? Look, I can keep going. I can get more resolution if I wanted, more contrast, darker darks. But this is a good technique for quick sketches, for drawings between 5-20 minutes. And if you want to go long, just be careful not to overwork the technique. But you definitely can do that. So there's the drawing. I think that's it.